The silence before death has a particular weight to it. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison had heard it dozens of times in combat zones across 3 continents, but never quite like this. In the cramped field hospital tent somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, that deadly quiet hung heavy as smoke. Outside, Taliban fighters had them completely surrounded. Inside, his wounded teammate was bleeding out on a makeshift operating table, while enemy bullets occasionally pinged off the metal surgical equipment. What happened next would challenge everything Morrison thought he knew about courage, sacrifice, and the thin line between life and death. Because sometimes, in the darkest moments of war, salvation comes from the most unexpected source. Sometimes, it comes from a single shot fired by someone who had sworn an oath to heal, not to kill. This is the story of how one nurse's impossible decision in a moment of absolute terror didn't just save lives that day. It changed the entire course of a mission that military historians would later call one of the most extraordinary rescues in special operations history. The helicopter blades chopped through the thin mountain air as Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison checked his equipment one final time. The briefing had been straightforward enough. Extract Dr. Sarah Chen and her medical team from a remote field hospital before Taliban forces could overrun their position. Intelligence suggested they had maybe 6 hours before the enemy reached the facility. Morrison's SEAL team had done extractions like this dozens of times before. What intelligence hadn't mentioned was that Dr. Chen would refuse to leave. The hospital sat in a valley surrounded by jagged peaks, a collection of military-green tents and hastily constructed bunkers that had been serving wounded Afghan civilians and coalition forces for the past 8 months. As Morrison's team fast dropped from their Black Hawk, he could already see the problem. Smoke rose from several buildings in the nearby village, and the distant sound of automatic weapons fire echoed off the canyon walls. Morrison hit the ground running, his boots kicking up dust as he sprinted toward the main medical tent. Behind him, his team of 6 SEALs spread out in defensive positions, their eyes scanning the ridgelines for enemy movement. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Rodriguez, Morrison's point man and closest friend, fell in beside him as they approached the hospital entrance. "LT, we've got movement on the eastern ridge," Rodriguez said through his comm system, his voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. "Looks like a scouting party. Maybe 4 or 5 Taliban fighters getting a look at our landing zone." Morrison nodded, processing the information as he pushed through the tent flap. Inside, the scene was controlled chaos. Medical personnel moved between patients with practice deficiency, but Morrison could see the tension in their faces. They knew what was coming. Dr. Sarah Chen looked up from where she was working on a wounded Afghan boy, her surgical scrubs stained with blood. She was smaller than Morrison had expected, maybe 5 feet 4 inches tall, with black hair pulled back in a tight ponytail and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Despite the circumstances, her hands remained perfectly steady as she continued her work. "Dr. Chen, I'm Lieutenant Commander Morrison. We're here to get you and your team out of here," he said, keeping his voice calm but urgent. Chen didn't look up from her patient. "I appreciate that, Commander, but we're not going anywhere. I have 3 patients who can't be moved, including this child. Moving them would kill them just as surely as leaving them for the Taliban." Morrison felt his jaw tighten. He'd dealt with stubborn civilians before, but never in a situation quite this desperate. Through his earpiece, he could hear his team reporting more enemy movement. The Taliban weren't just scouting anymore, they were positioning for an assault. "Ma'am, with all due respect, staying here will get everyone killed. My orders are to extract your entire team, and that's what we're going to do." Chen finally looked up, and Morrison saw something in her eyes that made him pause. It wasn't fear or stubbornness, it was the same look he'd seen in the mirror before every mission. Absolute determination. "Commander, I took an oath to do no harm. Abandoning these patients would violate everything I believe in. If you want to help, then help us defend this position until we can stabilize them for transport." Before Morrison could respond, the sharp crack of rifle fire erupted from outside the tent. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the comm. "Contact! We've got Taliban fighters moving down from the North Ridge. Estimate 24 hostiles, armed with AK-47s, and what looks like at least 1 RPG. Morrison cursed under his breath. The situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. He activated his radio to contact their helicopter support, but static was all that came back. The mountains were interfering with their communications, which meant no immediate extraction and no air support. "Dr. Chen, we need to move now. My team can't hold off a full assault with just 6 men." Chen's assistant, a young medic named Danny Walsh, looked up from where he was monitoring an IV drip. "Doctor, maybe we should listen to them. We can't help anyone if we're all dead." Chen shook her head firmly. "We have a responsibility to our patients." "Commander Morrison, your men are highly trained soldiers. I'm asking you to give us 30 minutes. That's all I need to stabilize the boy for transport." Morrison looked around the tent, taking in the scene. Besides the wounded child Chen was working on, there was an Afghan woman who appeared to have severe internal injuries, and a coalition soldier with what looked like a traumatic brain injury. All three were connected to various machines and monitors that would be impossible to transport quickly. Another burst of gunfire came from outside, closer this time. Petty Officer Second Class Tony Vasquez's voice came through the comm. "LT, they're probing our defenses. Looks like they're testing our response before the main assault." Morrison made a decision that would haunt him later. Against every tactical instinct he'd developed in 15 years of special operations, he chose to stay. Maybe it was something in Chen's unwavering conviction, or maybe it was the sight of that wounded child who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Either way, he activated his radio. "All units, we're setting up a defensive perimeter around the medical facility. ROE is weapons-free on any hostile targets. We hold this position until the medical team gives us the all-clear for extraction." Rodriguez appeared at the tent entrance, his M4 rifle at the ready. "LT, are you sure about this? We're outnumbered at least 4-1, with no air support and limited ammunition." Morrison nodded grimly. "We're sure, Marcus. Set up fields of fire on the north and east approaches. Use the medical bunkers for cover, but make sure you don't hit any of the equipment." As his team moved to establish their defensive positions, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The Taliban weren't known for their patience, and a prolonged firefight in this terrain favored the defenders only if they had overwhelming firepower and air support. Morrison's team had neither. Chen continued working on her patient, seemingly oblivious to the chaos building around her. Her focus was absolute, her movements precise and economical. Morrison found himself oddly impressed by her composure under pressure. "How long have you been running this facility, Doctor?" he asked, partly to keep his mind off their deteriorating tactical situation.
14 months, Chen replied without looking up.
"We've treated over 3,000 patients in that time. Coalition forces, Afghan military, civilians caught in crossfire. The locals started calling this place the safe tent because they knew they could get help here regardless of which side they were on." Morrison understood now why she was so reluctant to leave. This wasn't just a medical facility. It was a symbol of hope in a region that had seen precious little of it. The sound of gunfire intensified, and Morrison could hear his team returning fire. Through his earpiece, he listened to the tactical chatter as his men called out targets and ammunition counts. They were burning through their supplies faster than he'd hoped. "Contact front. I've got 3 tangos moving through the rocks at 2 o'clock, came Vasquez's voice. "I see them, taking the shot," replied Staff Sergeant Mike Thompson, the team's designated marksman. The sharp crack of Thompson's rifle was followed by Rodriguez's confirmation, "Target down." "But there's more coming up behind them." Morrison felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with combat. His team was good, among the best in the world, but they were facing a numerically superior enemy in terrain that offered limited cover and concealment. If the Taliban decided to press a coordinated assault, the SEALs would be hard-pressed to hold them off. Chen looked up from her patient, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool mountain air. "Commander, I need another 20 minutes. The bleeding is under control, but I have to make sure the internal suturing will hold during transport." 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours given their current situation. Morrison could see movement on multiple ridgelines now, as Taliban fighters maneuvered into attack positions. His team was reporting at least 40 enemy combatants, with more arriving every few minutes. "Dr. Pihai, Chen, I don't think we have 20 minutes. As if to punctuate his point, an RPG streaked across the valley and exploded against a supply bunker 50 meters away. The blast shook the medical tent, causing several pieces of equipment to topple over. One of Chen's assistants, a young nurse named Rebecca Martinez, steadied an IV stand while trying to keep a worried expression off her face. "Everyone stay calm," Chen said firmly. "We've dealt with shelling before. Just keep focusing on your patients." Morrison had to admire her leadership. Even with explosions going off around them, she maintained the calm, professional demeanor that her team needed to function effectively. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the comm again. "LT, they're massing for a major assault. I count at least 15 fighters moving down the western slope, and Thompson reports another group flanking us from the east. We're about to be surrounded." Morrison knew they had reached the point of no return. Once the Taliban completed their encirclement, extraction would become virtually impossible. He looked at Chen, who was still working frantically on her young patient. "Doctor, we need to go now. I'm sorry, but staying here any longer is suicide." Chen's hands never stopped moving as she spoke. "Give me 5 more minutes, Commander. I'm almost finished, and then we can move all 3 patients." 1. 5 minutes. Morrison had been in enough firefights to know that 5 minutes could feel like 5 hours when bullets were flying. He made another decision that went against his training. He would give her those 5 minutes, even if it meant risking the lives of his entire team. "All units we hold for 5 more minutes. Then we extract with all medical personnel and transportable patients. Start preparing demolition charges on any sensitive equipment." The gunfire outside intensified as the Taliban began their final assault. Morrison could hear the distinctive sounds of different weapons as enemy fighters closed in from multiple directions. His team was responding with disciplined, aimed fire, but he could tell from their voices that they were feeling the pressure. Chen finally stepped back from the operating table, pulling off her surgical gloves. "He's stable." "Danny, get him prepped for transport. Rebecca, help me with the woman." As the medical team worked to prepare their patients for evacuation, Morrison coordinated with his team on extraction routes and covering fire. The situation had gone from bad to worse, but they still had a chance if they moved quickly and kept their heads. That's when everything went completely wrong. A Taliban fighter had somehow managed to infiltrate their perimeter and was now inside the medical compound, moving between the tents with an AK-47 in his hands. Morrison saw him through the tent flap just as the man raised his weapon toward a group of medical personnel loading patients onto stretchers. Time seemed to slow down as Morrison realized he wouldn't be able to engage the target in time. The Taliban fighter had a clear shot at the medical team, and Morrison was too far away to intervene. In that moment, he understood that they were all about to die, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The Taliban fighter moved like a ghost between the medical tents, his weathered face set in grim determination as he raised his AK-47. Morrison watched in horror as the man took aim at Dr. Chen and her team, who were completely focused on loading their patients onto transport stretchers. The medical personnel had their backs turned, completely unaware of the deadly threat approaching from behind. Morrison's training kicked in automatically. He swung his rifle toward the target, but even as he did, he knew he wouldn't make it in time. The Taliban fighter had already acquired his targets and was beginning to squeeze the trigger. In another half-second, Dr. Chen and at least 3 members of her medical team would be cut down by automatic weapons fire. That's when Rebecca Martinez, the young nurse who had been helping stabilize patients throughout the firefight, did something that defied all logic and military protocol. She had been reaching for medical supplies in a storage locker when she spotted the Taliban fighter. Instead of diving for cover or shouting a warning, Martinez grabbed something from the medical kit and, in one fluid motion, turned and fired. The sound was sharp and distinctive. Not the crack of a rifle or the pop of a pistol, but the pneumatic hiss of a medical injector gun. The device, normally used to deliver emergency medications without needles, had been loaded with a dose of potassium chloride that Martinez had prepared for a cardiac patient. The Taliban fighter stumbled, more from surprise than any immediate physical effect. Potassium chloride, when injected directly into the bloodstream, could stop a heart within minutes, but Martinez hadn't hit a blood vessel. Instead, the injection had struck the man in his shoulder, and he was reacting more to the unexpected attack than to any life-threatening injury. But that moment of surprise was all Morrison needed. His rifle barked 3 times in rapid succession, and the Taliban fighter crumpled to the ground. Around the medical compound, Morrison could hear his team engaging targets as the enemy assault reached its peak intensity. The sound of gunfire was constant now, punctuated by the occasional explosion of an RPG or grenade. "Contact left! 2 more coming through the perimeter." Rodriguez's voice cut through the chaos. Morrison spun to see 2 more Taliban fighters rushing toward the main medical tent, their weapons raised. Behind him, he could hear Dr. Chen shouting instructions to her team as they tried to continue their patient evacuation under fire. The next few minutes became a blur of action and reaction. Morrison engaged the 2 new targets while his team fought desperately to maintain their defensive perimeter. Vasquez called out ammunition counts that were getting dangerously low. Thompson reported multiple targets on the eastern ridge. The Taliban were pressing their assault from all sides simultaneously, and Morrison's small team was being overwhelmed. "Danny, get that stretcher to the LZ now." Chen's voice carried over the gunfire. She was helping to carry the wounded Afghan boy, moving with surprising speed despite the chaos around her. Morrison provided covering fire as the medical team began their evacuation. Martinez was helping to carry the wounded woman, her face pale but determined. The young nurse had just killed a man, or at least contributed to his death, and Morrison could see the shock beginning to set in. But she kept moving, kept helping her patients, kept doing her job even as bullets whined overhead. The extraction route to their landing zone was only 200 meters, but it felt like 2 miles under enemy fire. Morrison's team had to leapfrog between defensive positions, with half the team providing covering fire while the other half moved the medical personnel and patients towards safety. LZ is hot. I count at least 6 tangos with direct line of sight to the landing zone. Staff Sergeant Thompson's voice crackled through Morrison's earpiece. Morrison cursed. Their extraction helicopter wouldn't be able to land under direct enemy fire, which meant they either had to clear the landing zone or find an alternative extraction point. Neither option looked promising given their current tactical situation. Dr. Chen appeared beside him, still helping to carry her young patient despite the gunfire around them. Commander, there's a clearing about half a kilometer north of here. It's hidden from the ridge lines. Could your helicopter reach us there? Morrison considered the option. Half a kilometer was a significant distance to move under fire, especially with wounded patients. But if the landing zone offered better protection from enemy observation, it might be their only chance. Rodriguez, what's your assessment of the northern route? Morrison called into his radio. Rough terrain, but it's got good cover from the rock formations. Problem is, we'd have to cross 2 open areas where we'd be exposed to fire from the eastern ridge. Morrison made another split-second decision that would determine whether they all lived or died. We take the northern route. Thompson, I need suppressing fire on that eastern ridge. Everyone else, we bound by teams to the alternate LZ. The movement began immediately. Morrison's SEALs were masters of tactical movement, and even under the extreme pressure of enemy contact, they maintained their discipline and coordination. The medical team proved surprisingly adept at following their instructions, moving quickly between covered positions while maintaining care of their patients. But the Taliban weren't about to let them escape easily. As Morrison's group reached the first open area that Rodriguez had identified, enemy fighters opened up from multiple positions simultaneously. The concentrated fire was devastating, kicking up dirt and rock fragments all around them. One of Chen's medical assistants, a young man named Peter Kim, cried out as a bullet grazed his leg. "Keep moving! Don't stop!" Morrison shouted over the gunfire. Martinez was still helping to carry the wounded woman when she stumbled, nearly dropping her end of the stretcher. Morrison could see that the young nurse was struggling with the psychological impact of what had happened back at the medical tent. She had crossed a line that medical personnel were never supposed to cross, and the weight of that decision was hitting her hard. Dr. Chen noticed Martinez's distress immediately. Even while moving under fire, she managed to shift position so she could speak directly to the young nurse. "Rebecca, you saved our lives back there. You did what you had to do to protect your patients and your colleagues. That's what healers do. We protect life, even when it means making impossible choices." Martinez nodded, her grip on the stretcher steadying. Morrison was impressed by Chen's leadership under pressure. She was managing to provide both medical care and psychological support to her team while moving through an active combat zone. The second open area was even more dangerous than the first. Taliban fighters had repositioned themselves to get better angles of fire, and Morrison could see muzzle flashes from at least a dozen different locations. His team's ammunition situation was becoming critical, and they were still 300 meters from the alternate landing zone. "LT, I'm down to 2 magazines," Vasquez reported. "Same here," added Thompson. "And I'm seeing more hostiles moving in from the south. Looks like they're trying to cut off our escape route." Morrison felt the familiar weight of command decision-making. Every choice he made in the next few minutes would determine who lived and who died. His team was running out of ammunition, the enemy was closing in from multiple directions, and they still had to cross the most dangerous part of their route. That's when Dr. Chen made a suggestion that nobody saw coming. "Commander, what if we don't run from them?" Morrison looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "Ma'am, the Taliban fighters are focused on pursuing us, right? They're moving quickly, taking risks to catch us before we reach your helicopter. What if we turn that aggression against them?" Morrison was beginning to understand what she was suggesting, and it was either brilliant or completely insane. "You're talking about setting up an ambush." "I'm talking about using their momentum against them. Let them chase us into a position where your men have the advantage." Rodriguez had been listening to the conversation while providing rear security. "LT, there's a natural choke point about 50 meters ahead, a narrow passage between 2 rock formations. If we could get the medical team through and then set up on the far side, Morrison nodded slowly. It was a risky plan, but their current situation was already beyond risky. If they continued trying to run, the Taliban would eventually overtake them through sheer numbers. But if they could turn the pursuit into an ambush, they might be able to even the odds. Thompson, Vasquez, can you two get the medical team and patients through that choke point and provide security on the far side? Roger that, LT. Rodriguez, you and I will set up the ambush. Kim, Henderson, you provide overwatch from the high ground. Morrison turned to Dr. Wage. Chen. Doctor, this is going to get very ugly very quickly. I need your team to get through that passage and then stay down until we give the all clear.
Chen nodded, her expression showing she understood the gravity of the situation.
We'll be ready. As the medical team moved through the narrow passage with their patients, Morrison and Rodriguez positioned themselves on either side of the choke point. Morrison could hear the Taliban fighters approaching, their voices carrying on the mountain air as they coordinated their pursuit. The ambush was textbook perfect. Morrison's team had chosen their positions well, and when the Taliban fighters rushed through the narrow passage, they found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire with no cover and no escape route. The firefight was brief but intense, and when it was over, the immediate threat had been neutralized. But Morrison knew their problems were far from over. The gunfire would have alerted every Taliban fighter in the area to their exact location, and reinforcements would be arriving soon. They had maybe 10 minutes to reach the alternate landing zone and get their helicopter on the ground. Martinez was helping to load patients onto stretchers when Morrison noticed her hands were shaking. The young nurse had held up remarkably well during the firefight, but the accumulated stress was beginning to show. You did good back there, Martinez, Morrison told her as they prepared to move out. She looked up at him with haunted eyes. I killed someone, didn't I? That injection, I knew what it could do.
Morrison paused.
He had seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers after their first combat experience. The realization that you had taken a life, regardless of the circumstances, was something that changed a person forever. You saved lives, Morrison replied simply. Sometimes that's what it takes. The final approach to the alternate landing zone was the longest 300 meters of Morrison's military career. His team was exhausted, low on ammunition, and carrying wounded patients through rough terrain while being pursued by an unknown number of enemy fighters. But they kept moving, kept fighting, kept protecting the people they had sworn to extract. When Morrison finally saw the helicopter approaching their position, he felt a surge of relief that he would remember for the rest of his life. But even as the aircraft settled onto the rocky landing zone, he could see Taliban fighters moving through the trees on the surrounding ridgelines. Their escape window was closing rapidly. Everyone on board now! Morrison shouted over the roar of the helicopter's engines. The medical team moved efficiently, loading their patients into the aircraft with practiced precision. Martinez was the last of the medical personnel to board, turning back to look at Morrison with an expression of profound gratitude mixed with lingering trauma. As Morrison's team provided final covering fire and prepared to board the helicopter, he caught Dr. Chen's eye. She nodded once, a simple gesture that somehow conveyed everything that needed to be said between two professionals who had faced an impossible situation and somehow found a way through it. The helicopter lifted off just as Taliban fighters reached the edge of the landing zone, their weapons blazing uselessly at the retreating aircraft. Morrison looked down at the mountains below, knowing that the events of this day would stay with all of them forever. But they had accomplished something extraordinary. Not just a successful extraction, but a demonstration of what people could achieve when they refused to abandon their principles, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Dr. Chen had refused to leave her patients. Martinez had acted to protect her colleagues. Morrison's team had risked everything to give them the time they needed. As the helicopter carried them towards safety, Morrison realized that the nurse's lone shot, that moment when Rebecca Martinez had grabbed a medical injector and used it as a weapon to save lives, would become the defining moment of the entire mission. It was a perfect symbol of what they had all done that day, used whatever tools they had available to protect the people who couldn't protect themselves. But Morrison also knew that the story was far from over. The psychological impact of the day's events would affect everyone who had been there, and the ripple effects of their actions would extend far beyond the immediate mission. What they had accomplished would change how Special Operations Forces approached medical evacuation missions in hostile territory. More importantly, it would change how they thought about the courage and capability of the medical personnel they were sometimes called upon to protect. The debriefing room at Bagram Air Base was sterile and cold, a stark contrast to the chaotic mountain battlefield they had escaped just 18 hours earlier. Lieutenant Commander Morrison sat across from Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base intelligence officer, while she reviewed the after-action report that would become one of the most studied documents in modern special operations history.
Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Commander, Hayes said, looking up from the classified folder in front of her. Your team held a defensive position for over an hour against a numerically superior enemy force, conducted a tactical withdrawal under fire, executed a successful ambush, and extracted all personnel and patients without a single friendly casualty.
Morrison nodded. That's correct, ma'am. And the key moment in this entire operation was when a civilian nurse used a medical injector loaded with potassium chloride to incapacitate an enemy combatant who had infiltrated your perimeter. Yes, ma'am. If Martinez hadn't acted when she did, we would have lost at least 4 people in that tent, including Dr. Chen. Hayes made a note in the file. Where is Nurse Martinez now? Dr. Chen recommended it after she noticed signs of acute stress reaction during the flight back to base. Morrison had been thinking about Martinez constantly since their return. The young nurse had saved multiple lives with her quick thinking and decisive action, but the psychological cost was becoming apparent. She had violated one of the most fundamental principles of medical ethics. First, do no harm, and was struggling to reconcile that with the fact that her actions had prevented a massacre. Dr. Chen had taken Martinez under her wing during the debriefing process, explaining to the military psychologists that medical personnel often faced ethical dilemmas in combat zones that their training hadn't fully prepared them for. The line between healer and protector could become blurred when lives hung in the balance. What's your assessment of Dr. Chen's performance during the operation? Hayes asked. Morrison considered his answer carefully. Military officers were trained to evaluate civilian contractors objectively, focusing on their cooperation with tactical directives and their ability to function under pressure. But Dr. Chen had transcended those simple metrics. Outstanding, ma'am. Dr. Chen showed exceptional leadership throughout the operation. She maintained medical standards under extreme conditions, made sound tactical suggestions that improved our mission success, and provided crucial psychological support to her team when they needed it most. The report mentions that she initially refused extraction. Yes, ma'am. But her reasoning was sound from a medical standpoint. Moving those patients without proper stabilization would have killed them. By insisting we stay, she forced us to find a tactical solution that saved more lives than a simple extraction would have. Hayes nodded, making another note. Morrison could see she was building towards something, but he wasn't sure what. Commander, this operation is going to receive significant attention from military leadership. The tactical innovations your team employed, combined with the unprecedented cooperation between special operations forces and medical personnel, represent a potential paradigm shift in how we conduct extraction missions. Morrison felt a mixture of pride and concern. Recognition was always welcome, but he knew that too much attention could complicate future operations. Ma'am, if I may, the real heroes of this operation were the medical personnel. They maintained their professionalism and dedication to their patients under conditions that would challenge experienced combat soldiers. Hayes smiled slightly. That's exactly the kind of leadership perspective that makes this operation so noteworthy, Commander. You and Dr. Chen found a way to merge medical ethics with military necessity. That's not something you see in the textbooks. Later that evening, Morrison found himself in the base medical facility, checking on the 3 patients who had been evacuated from the mountain hospital. The wounded Afghan boy was recovering well from his surgery, his vital signs stable and his prognosis good. The woman with internal injuries was still in critical condition but improving. The coalition soldier with the head trauma was awake and responding to commands. Dr. Chen was reviewing charts at the nurse's station when Morrison approached. She looked tired but satisfied. The way medical professionals looked after a difficult case had turned out successfully. How were they doing? Morrison asked. Better than I dared hope during the operation. The boy should make a complete recovery. The others will need more time, but their prognoses are good. Chen looked up from her charts. I wanted to thank you again, Commander. What you and your team did yesterday, staying to give us time to stabilize the patients, that went against everything in your tactical manual, didn't it? Morrison nodded. Military doctrine says you extract civilians immediately and sort out medical issues at a secure facility. But sometimes doctrine doesn't account for the human factor. Rebecca has been asking to see you. Chen said quietly. She's struggling with what happened. I think it would help if she could hear from you that she made the right choice. Morrison found Martinez in a private room down the hall, staring out the window at the mountains where their firefight had taken place. She looked younger than her 26 years, and Morrison could see the weight of what she had done in the set of her shoulders. Mind if I sit down? Morrison asked. Martinez nodded without turning from the window.
Dr. Chen says you wanted to talk to me.
I wanted to thank you, actually. What you did yesterday saved lives. My life. Dr. Chen's life, probably everyone in that tent. I used a medical device as a weapon, Martinez said quietly. I violated every principle I swore to uphold when I became a nurse. Morrison had dealt with this kind of moral injury before, usually with his own soldiers after difficult combat operations. The psychological wounds were often harder to heal than the physical ones. Martinez, can I tell you something? In 15 years of special operations, I've never seen courage like what you displayed yesterday. You saw a threat to your patients and your colleagues, and you acted to protect them using the tools you had available. That's not a violation of your medical ethics. That's the highest expression of them. Martinez finally turned to look at him. How do you live with it? Taking a life? Morrison was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer honestly without being dismissive of her struggle. It's not easy. It's something you carry with you always. But you learn to balance the weight of what you had to do against the lives you saved by doing it. Yesterday, your actions protected innocent people who couldn't protect themselves. That matters. Chen says the same thing, but it's hard to accept. It should be hard to accept. The fact that it troubles you means you're exactly the kind of person who should be making those life and death decisions. People who find it easy to hurt others, even when necessary, aren't the ones you want in positions of responsibility. Over the following weeks, the story of the mountain extraction began to spread through military circles. Morrison's team received commendations for their tactical performance, but more importantly, the operation led to changes in how medical evacuations were planned and executed in combat zones. Chen was invited to speak at the Military Medical Conference in Germany, where she presented a paper on maintaining medical standards in austere environments. Her presentation included detailed case studies from the mountain hospital, demonstrating how medical personnel could contribute to tactical decision-making without compromising their professional obligations. Martinez eventually returned to duty, but she requested a transfer to a trauma surgery unit where she could focus on emergency medical interventions. Morrison heard later that she had become one of the most skilled emergency nurses in the European theatre, known for her ability to remain calm and make critical decisions under extreme pressure. 6 months after the operation, Morrison received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Chen. She was calling from a new field hospital in Syria, where she was leading another medical team in a conflict zone. Commander, I wanted to let you know that we've implemented some of the tactical procedures we learned during our operation in Afghanistan. We've been working with local special operations forces to develop better coordination protocols for medical evacuations. Morrison was pleased but not surprised. Chen had always struck him as someone who would take lessons learned and apply them to help others. How's your team adapting to the new procedures?
Better than expected.
We've had 3 emergency extractions since arriving here, and each one went more smoothly because of what we learned from you and your team. More importantly, we saved patients who might have been lost under the old evacuation protocols. Morrison felt a surge of professional satisfaction. Military operations were successful not just when they achieved their immediate objectives, but when they contributed to improvements in future operations. Dr. Chen, can I ask you something? After everything that happened on that mountain, do you ever regret your decision to stay and stabilize those patients? There was a long pause before Chen answered.
Commander, every decision in medicine involves weighing risks and benefits.
On that mountain, the risk of staying seemed enormous, but the benefit, saving those lives, was worth it. What I learned is that sometimes the greatest risk is not taking any risk at all. Morrison thought about that conversation for months afterward. Military leadership often involved making decisions with incomplete information under extreme pressure, but medical leadership involved the same challenges with the added weight of the Hippocratic Oath. Dr. Chen had found a way to honor both sets of obligations, and in doing so, had demonstrated a form of courage that Morrison deeply respected. The final chapter of the story came 2 years later, when Morrison was attending a military medical symposium in Washington, D.C. The keynote speaker was Dr. Sarah Chen, now the Director of Battlefield Medicine for an international humanitarian organization. Her presentation was titled, "When Healers Must Fight, Ethical Decision-Making in Combat Medical Operations." In the audience, Morrison spotted a familiar face, Rebecca Martinez, now wearing the uniform of a major in the Army Medical Corps. She had completed additional training in emergency medicine and was serving as a medical advisor to special operations units. After Chen's presentation, the 3 of them met for dinner at a quiet restaurant near the Pentagon. The conversation inevitably turned to that day on the mountain and how it had affected each of their careers. "I still think about that injection sometimes," Martinez admitted. But I've learned to see it differently. I wasn't using a medical device as a weapon. I was using whatever tools I had available to protect my patients. That's fundamentally different.
Chen nodded. Rebecca, you've become an exceptional military medical officer because you understand that healing sometimes requires difficult choices.
The ability to make those choices while maintaining your ethical core is what separates good medics from great ones. Morrison raised his glass to impossible choices and the people brave enough to make them. As they drank their toast, Morrison reflected on how a single moment of crisis had changed all their lives. Martinez had discovered reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. Chen had proven that medical ethics and military necessity weren't mutually exclusive. And Morrison had learned that true leadership sometimes meant abandoning doctrine in favor of doing what was right. The story of the nurse's loan shot had become more than just another military operation. It had become a case study in leadership, ethics, and the kind of courage that emerged when people refused to abandon their principles, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Years later, when Morrison was teaching leadership courses to young officers, he would always include the mountain extraction in his curriculum, not because of the tactical innovations or the successful mission outcome, but because of what it demonstrated about the human capacity to find solutions when conventional approaches failed. The lesson was simple but profound. Sometimes the most important shot fired in a battle isn't the one that kills the enemy, but the one that saves your friends. And sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who never intended to be heroes at all. They were just people doing their jobs with extraordinary courage when everything else had gone wrong. Martinez's injection that day had lasted only seconds, but its impact had rippled through the military medical community for years. It had challenged assumptions about the roles of medical personnel in combat zones, demonstrated the importance of adaptability in crisis situations, and proven that ethical behavior and tactical success weren't mutually exclusive. Most importantly, it had shown that in the darkest moments of conflict, when death seemed inevitable and hope was fading, ordinary people could still find ways to choose life over death, healing over harm, and courage over fear. That choice, made by a young nurse with a medical injector in a tent surrounded by enemy fighters, had changed everything.